Hi there, BookTube. It's Ros, the Scally Dandling about the books.
And Tilly from Tilly's Shelf.
And we're here because it's Victober, as we know.
Yes, and we've got together for the all-important task of discussing Victober-related phenomena.
Yeah.
And it's another discussing drama.
Yeah, it's time we did a discussion drama, and we always like, if we can, to do one that fits in with Victober and read a Victorian play.
Yeah.
And of course, in Victober, we all tend to read a lot of lovely
Big Victorian novels. And short stories, of course. Popular Victorian short stories.
That's one of the challenges. And this year I've been encouraging people to
read poetry.
Victorian poetry, which Victorians love so much. But plays.
Yeah, I mean, the theatre was a massive thing in the Victorian era. It's one of the main sources of entertainment. If you think about it, people didn't have at home what we had. Yeah. It was kind of the era just before the start of the cinema.
Yes.
And a theatre could appeal to a huge cross-section of society.
Yeah.
And there was suddenly like quite a big population that could afford to go maybe into the cheaper seats, but could afford to go to the theatre on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah.
The theatre being a space where you could meet your friends. It was maybe somewhere that was warmer and sociable, and it was where you'd see people, you'd hear the news of the day, and see these plays that were sometimes just light-hearted and comical, and sometimes were kind of looking at the challenging issues of the day and questioning those.
In the same way that Victorian novels do, as we know. You were mentioning about Bleak House and how the
Bleak
theatre...
House is a section where they're staying in London, and they go to the theatre like really regularly and see people at the theatre.
Yeah. So people would, like, if they could afford it, would go to like every play in the season. Night, they might go, more than once a week and so on. So it was a big part of Victorian sort of cultural life and social life and fun. So it's really great to read a play in Victober, and we decided to read one that was a big success, a big box office success,
even though it's maybe not one that's as well known now. Like, I mean, a couple of weeks ago I went to see another adaptation of The Importance of Being Earnest, and that one is one that people come back to constantly because it's Oscar Wilde and it's hilarious. But this one it is still known, but not as well known.
Yes, but if a Victorian person at the time, everybody would have known this play.
And it's a scandalous play.
Very, very scandalous.
Yes. Maybe not to modern sensibilities, but
it was then.
And should we say what play it was? It's The Second Mrs Tanqueray
by Arthur Wing Pinero, first performed in 1893.
So did you want to tell us a little bit about Arthur Wing Pinero?
I will. I would love to.
I will just say there might be a little bit of noise outside from some building work that we haven't done.
But we're going to plough on unless it becomes too noisy. So, Arthur Wing Pinero, he lived in London. His family were Sephardic Jews from Portugal who'd sort of fled and wound up in London. And his grandfather was a successful solicitor. His father was a less successful solicitor, and who then died young. And Pinero actually left school at the age of 10, it was really interesting thinking about. I just read David Copperfield, which reminded me about how Dickens also left school initially, really young, and went to work in a factory, in fact,
And he didn't stop them from producing these.
And yet, here they are becoming, it's a very different world, isn't it? That reminds us of ways in which the Victorian world was different. Because what Pinero did was he went to evening classes to try and keep his education going.
And he wanted to be, despite the bad example set by his father, he did want to be a solicitor originally.
Yes, he thought this was what he should do, because when he left school, he was a clerk in the solicitor's office but he went to Birkbeck College to do these sort of like evening classes and got involved in amateur dramatics, which was
a very popular
thing in Victorian times. And he just discovered a real love of the theatre. And by the age of 19, he decided, forget boring old law, I'm going to be an actor. And he became a professional actor at age 19. And then quite soon in his early 20s, he started writing plays as well as being an actor.
Yeah.
And wrote really successful comedies and farces and made a good living. He was a well-known
comical
playwright.
And then things changed as he got a little bit older, and he kind of changed his style. Did you want to say a bit more about how that happened?
He was born in 1855, so beginning of the 1890s, he's a mature man. He's thinking, I'm a successful playwright. Maybe I could do something a bit different, rather than he always tried to make his farces apparently have more realistic characters than the classic farce. So he had ambitions to be, take it to another level. But then something interesting happened.
And I think you should say that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the plays of Ibsen started to be performed on the London stage, and to sort of some criticism but also acclaim, and Pinero went and saw some of these, and he went particularly to see Ghosts, and he came away from that thinking,
I could do better.
Not
better than Ibsen, but better than what I have been doing.
I'm old-fashioned now, what I'm writing, and I need to, I'm going to try and take things to another level. Yeah. And so he started to write more serious plays.
Yeah, but also I think saw the plays of Ibsen and potentially thought, audiences are ready for this, audiences are watching this and interested in these maybe slightly more serious or controversial themes.
Topics, absolutely. And so he wrote a play called The Profligate about a man with a past. And when that was put on, the theatre company didn't let him give it the sort of tragic ending that he wanted to. So he thought, well, next one, I'm jolly well going to hold out for the play that I want to write. And he wrote The Second Mrs Tanqueray, and with a tragic ending. And it was supposed to go on in after Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan as the next play in the season of that theatre company, but the theatre manager said, no, this is too outrageous, audiences won't wear this, too scandalous, we're not putting this on. So it didn't, but he found another company that would put it on, and they were a bit like, are you sure? But they went for it,
and it was a major commercial success, if I can get the words out.
Runaway box office.
Yeah, sold out tickets, it kept going.
So obviously it was timely for a Victorian audience, the issues that he wanted to cover, and covering them in a much more frank way. Yeah. Do you want to say kind of what the play's about?
So what is the play about? The play is about the second Mrs Tanqueray and her husband Aubrey. So it starts with Aubrey meeting his friends and saying, look, I'm about to get married, and I know when people get married they sometimes fall out with their friends a little bit, and his friends are sort of like, well, have you got a specific reason for thinking why we're going to fall out? And they kind of work out and kind of that his wife's not somebody who's going to be seen as very socially acceptable. And it turns out that she is somebody who has made her way in the world in the past as, I suppose, a paid companion. So somebody who's lived with well-to-do gentlemen as a hostess is a word that they use, and posed as a married woman and being referred to as Mrs Jarman is one of her aliases, but hasn't ever actually been married. But he does marry her, and he does quite clearly love her.
Really loves her, and feels like she's that this shouldn't be held against her, and that that he can save her is pretty, but at that feeling of like, actually, we love each other and it doesn't matter. And
there's a lot of talk at the start of the play and also later on in the play of, we'll just forget about what's happened before. And I guess one of the challenges of the play is that they can't forget and they can't ignore it, and the society around them certainly isn't forgetting about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obviously, this was a problem in Victorian times, in Victorian morality, of how to deal with women who'd had previous sexual relationships or before marriage, and
it's something that gets analysed again and again in Victorian literature.
It does
incredibly frequently, and we were kind of looking at other books that have that theme in, like Tess came out in the same decade, just a couple of years before, and Tess has to address it slightly differently, or Hardy chooses to address it slightly differently, by making Tess so innocent and so perfect and so virtuous, aside from her one kind of a sin, I suppose, which is not necessarily,
and that feeling that it might have been forced
on her. And that she is actually, innocent and should be kind of held up as pure. And that's not the case for Mrs. Tanqueray. Like, you don't know exactly the path that's led her into this life, but she's been conscious, she's been aware, and she's made certain decisions, and she's not perfect even when she is restored to social acceptability, semi-social acceptability by marriage.
She's grumpy and oversensitive and so on,
and jealous,
and understandably, because she knows her position is uncertain,
she's got a huge level of insecurity.
She's sort of expecting to be disapproved of, and then she is,
and it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle.
Sort of cycle, and then she pushes people away because I mean, it does, as you say, it comes up again and again in novels. I just read David Copperfield, and there's little Emily in that, and like Dickens, he kind of makes out that it's this incredibly noble thing that Emily's family do in sort of forgiving her, and David says, it might almost have been better if she'd died young, so that this could, so huge. There was huge levels of judgment, weren't there? And this play, when we started reading it, we were worried, is this going to be a bit misogynist? And actually, it is still Victorian values, and but it really is examining the double standard.
And I guess the interesting thing is there's multiple characters in it, and there's also a second character who's also a woman with a past, who's somebody that Mrs. Tanqueray knew kind of in her former life, who has also managed to make a respectable marriage now, and who's also experiencing this same exclusion, but experiencing it in a very different way, I suppose. And there's a lot of conversation about the fact that it's not just women who have past, and that a lot of men have a past in that era, and in that social class as well, because we're talking about kind of an upper class set, which is where Victorian theatre was often set in.
But the male characters, I suppose that's what's interesting, actually acknowledge, why is it one rule for us and one rule for women? That's actually brought out explicitly. I mean, and in terms of how as a dramatist he does this, what I really liked was the way the book the play starts quite light-hearted.
And it starts really filled with comedy.
Very funny. You could tell he'd been a writer of successful comedies, because I was laughing out loud.
Absolutely.
At some of the early scenes and the witty dialogue. Think Oscar Wilde.
Very similar. Kind of,
and then it gradually shifts into
gets more emotionally challenging.
Yes, I mean, it's a melodrama, I suppose, and it has a really effective bit about the relationship between a couple who do love each other, but also fail to communicate successfully,
and can't quite get past the issues that they were saying. We can forget about that, but they can't actually get past it.
And then all the way to a tragic end.
A very tragic end, I guess one thing to say, we were talking about the men openly saying that why have we got these double standards? There's also a point when Mrs. Tanqueray says to a young female character who's held up as this kind of angelic type character.
She nearly became a nun,
She nearly became a nun, but she didn't. And this woman has decided, wants to get married to a man who has got a past, but has forgiven him for that. And she says, you've forgiven him immediately, but you haven't forgiven me for the same thing. And that's just typical that you're kind of holding this continuing to uphold this double standard, and it wasn't the men that was doing it. It was
the women could hold that double standard too, and absolutely did. And that one of the challenges for Mr. Tanqueray is that he can accept her as his wife and love her and want to, but then when she's associating with his daughter by his first marriage, the angelic character, then that really challenges his feelings about I can choose to love her, but is
she going to pollute my daughter?
My pure daughter? So,
and is that going to affect my daughter's standing in society? If she's known to associate with her.
So, an all-round really successful play, I thought.
Yes, and I think we should stop as it's
getting noisy, as we feared it might. So, if you've read it, do comment
and share your thoughts.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for watching.
Bye.